John Harper was not your average guy. He wasn't the kind of person you'd see sipping coffee at a cafe or scrolling through his phone on a park bench. No, John lived life differently, on his own terms, far away from the noise and chaos of cities. His world was quiet, rugged, and raw, just the way he liked it. After spending years as a Navy SEAL, where danger lurked around every corner and decisions had to be made in split seconds, John craved something simpler: peace. But for someone like him, simple didn't mean lazy or uneventful. Instead, it meant freedom, the ability to live without interference, surrounded by nature and purpose. Years ago, after retiring from active duty, John purchased a large piece of land nestled deep in the countryside. It wasn't fancy or polished. There were no manicured lawns or perfectly painted fences here. The property sprawled across acres of dense woods, open fields, and rocky terrain. To most people, it might have looked wild and untamed, but to John, it was paradise. Every inch of the land spoke to him, a place where he could breathe easy, think clearly, and focus on what truly mattered: training others. You see, John hadn't completely left behind his military roots. While he was done with combat missions, he still carried a passion for teaching. So he turned his land into a training ground, a sort of boot camp for elite soldiers preparing for some of the toughest assignments imaginable. From sunrise to sunset, recruits would push themselves to their limits under John's watchful eye. They practiced stealth movements, learned how to survive in harsh conditions, and honed their skills in hand-to-hand combat. It was intense, grueling work, but also rewarding. These weren't ordinary trainees. They were Navy SEAL hopefuls, Special Forces operators, and other highly skilled individuals who needed an edge before heading into dangerous situations overseas. Life on the property was anything but dull. Mornings began early, with the sound of birds chirping blending seamlessly with the distant echo of commands shouted during drills. By midday, sweat-soaked uniforms hung out to dry near makeshift racks while recruits reviewed tactics over meals cooked over an open fire. At night, the forest came alive with the hum of insects and the occasional hoot of an owl, providing a serene backdrop to tactical discussions held under flickering lantern light. For John, this routine was perfect. It kept him sharp, grounded, and connected to the values that defined him: discipline, loyalty, and strength. Despite all the activity, John preferred to keep to himself when it came to interacting with the outside world. He wasn't antisocial, he just valued his privacy. Neighbors rarely ventured close enough to disturb him, though occasionally they'd catch glimpses of strange sights: camouflage nets strung between trees, obstacle courses scattered throughout, the woods, or even the occasional burst of gunfire from blanks used in training exercises. Some folks whispered about what went on behind those gates, speculating about secret government operations or covert missions. But John paid them no mind. Let them talk, he thought. As long as they stayed off his property, he had no reason to care. For years, this arrangement worked beautifully. John's recruits came and went, each group leaving more prepared than when they arrived. The land remained untouched by outsiders, a fortress of solitude where only those invited could enter. And then, one fateful day, everything changed. A letter arrived in the mailbox. A small, seemingly harmless envelope that would set off a chain of events neither John nor anyone else could have predicted. At first glance, the letter appeared official. Its crisp white paper bore the logo of a local homeowners association, HOA, complete with bold letters and a neatly printed address. Inside, however, lay a message that made John raise an eyebrow. Apparently, someone had filed a complaint against him. The accusations? His gravel driveway raised too much dust, and his hedges, well, they weren't trimmed neatly enough to meet community standards. John stared at the page for a moment, half amused and half confused. Community standards? What community? His closest neighbor lived miles away, and the nearest actual neighborhood was even farther. Whoever sent this letter clearly hadn't done their homework. Still, John decided not to let it bother him. People complained about all sorts of nonsense these days. and he figured this was just another example of bureaucracy gone awry. Tossing the letter onto the kitchen counter, he went back to supervising a group of recruits practicing rappelling techniques down a steep hillside. If anything, the absurdity of the complaint made him chuckle. Dusty driveways and overgrown shrubs? Hardly the biggest threats he'd faced in his lifetime. But little did John know, this was only the beginning. The letter was merely a warning, shot, a prelude to something much bigger and stranger than he could have imagined. Somewhere out there, forces were gathering, determined to invade his peaceful existence. Forces that had no idea who they were dealing with. The letter might have been easy to ignore at first, but it wasn't long before John realized this was more than just a random complaint. A few weeks passed, and life on his property continued as usual. The recruits trained hard. The drills went on, and the forest remained quiet except for the sounds of footsteps crunching through leaves or the occasional shout during exercises. But then, one sunny afternoon, something unusual happened. Two men appeared at the entrance to John's land, standing just outside the heavy iron gate that marked the boundary of his property. At first glance, they looked like they were trying to look official. Both wore uniforms, dark blue shirts with shiny badges pinned to their chests, and carried clipboards tucked under their arms. One of them had a hat pulled low over his forehead, while the other squinted against the sunlight as he peered through the gate. They didn't seem particularly threatening, but there was something about their presence that felt off. Maybe it was the way they stood too casually, or how their uniforms seemed slightly mismatched as if borrowed from different places. Whatever it was, John immediately sensed that these weren't ordinary visitors. He walked toward the gate slowly, his boots crunching against the gravel driveway. His expression remained calm, but his eyes scanned the men carefully. Years of military training had taught him to assess any situation quickly, and right now his instincts were telling him to stay alert. When he reached the gate, he stopped and crossed his arms, waiting for them to speak. "Good afternoon," said the taller of the two men, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We're here on behalf of the local homeowners association. We need to conduct an inspection of your property." John raised an eyebrow. "Homeowners association?" he repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "This isn't part of any HOA. My property is private." The shorter man shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his partner as if seeking support. "Well, sir, we've received reports of certain violations," he explained, consulting the clipboard in his hands. "Things like overgrown vegetation, improper landscaping, and, He hesitated, flipping through the pages as though searching for the exact wording. "A dusty driveway." John blinked. For a moment he thought he'd misheard. Had these men really driven all the way out here to complain about dust? It was almost laughable. Almost. But instead of laughing, John kept his tone steady and firm. "I'm sorry, gentlemen, but I don't answer to any HOA. This is my land, and I manage it however I see fit." The taller man frowned, clearly not used to being told no. "Sir, we're just doing our job," he said, his voice taking on a slightly sharper edge. "If you refuse to cooperate, we'll have no choice but to escalate the matter." John tilted his head slightly, studying them. There was something odd about the way they spoke. Their confidence seemed forced, their authority hollow. Most legitimate inspectors wouldn't threaten escalation so quickly. And why would an HOA care about a remote piece of land miles away from any actual neighborhood? Something wasn't adding up. "I appreciate your concern," John replied evenly, "but I'm going to ask you to leave. You're trespassing on private property, and I won't hesitate to call the authorities if necessary." The two men exchanged a glance, clearly unsure how to respond. After a tense pause, the shorter one muttered something under his breath and stepped back toward their truck. The taller man lingered for a moment longer, glaring at John as if trying to intimidate him. But intimidation was a game John knew well, and he wasn't about to fold. "Fine," the man snapped finally. "But don't say we didn't warn you." With that, they climbed into their vehicle and drove off, leaving behind a cloud of dust that settled slowly onto the gravel road. For a while, John stood there, watching the truck disappear down the winding path that led away from his property. He didn't trust those men. Their visit had been strange, and their behavior even stranger. Still, he figured it was probably a one-time thing, a mix-up or some bureaucratic mistake that would blow over soon enough. So, he shrugged it off and returned to his daily routine, focusing once again on the task at hand, training his recruits. But the men didn't go away. Over the next few weeks, they kept coming back. At first, it was subtle, notes taped to his front door, warning him about violations and demanding immediate action. Then came the phone calls, persistent and annoying, always at inconvenient times. John ignored them all, refusing to engage, but the intrusions didn't stop there. Eventually, the men started parking their truck just outside his fence line, sitting there for hours as if surveilling the property. It was clear they weren't giving up. One evening, after yet another frustrating day of dodging their antics, John sat on his porch sipping a cup of coffee. The sun was setting, casting golden hues across the fields and woods surrounding his home. Normally, this was his favorite time of day, a chance to unwind and reflect. But tonight his mind was occupied. Who were these men, really? And why were they so determined to bother him? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of tires crunching on gravel. Looking up, he saw the familiar truck pulling up to the gate again. This time, however, the men didn't stay inside. Instead, they got out and approached the entrance, their clipboards in hand. Before John could react, they began unlatching the gate and walking onto his property without permission. "What are you doing?" John called out, rising from his chair. His voice was calm but carried a note of steel that made the men freeze momentarily. "We're conducting an inspection," the taller man said, trying to sound authoritative. "You've been non-compliant and we need to verify the conditions of your property." John's jaw tightened. These men were either incredibly bold or incredibly stupid. Either way, they were about to learn a valuable lesson. "I already told you," he said, stepping forward. "You don't have the right to be here. Leave now, or I'll make you leave." The shorter man laughed nervously, glancing around at the vast expanse of wilderness surrounding them. "Relax, buddy. It's just a quick look around, no big deal." "No big deal?" John echoed, his tone dropping lower. "You're trespassing on private land. That makes it a very big deal." The tension in the air grew thicker with each passing second. The men hesitated, unsure how far they could push before things escalated. But John wasn't bluffing. If anything, he was barely holding back. Decades of experience in high-pressure situations had taught him patience, but also when to draw the line. And these men had just crossed it. As the standoff continued, John's mind raced. He needed to handle this situation carefully. Violence wasn't the answer, but neither was backing down. These imposters had underestimated him, thinking he was just another homeowner they could bully into submission. What they didn't realize was that John Harper wasn't just any homeowner. He was a former Navy SEAL, a man who thrived in chaos and excelled in strategy. And he was about to show them exactly what that meant. The tension at the gate was palpable, like the calm before a storm. John stood firm, his eyes locked onto the two men who had dared to step onto his property uninvited. They tried to act casual, glancing around as if they owned the place, but their nervous energy betrayed them. The taller man adjusted his hat awkwardly, while the shorter one clutched his clipboard tightly, as though it might somehow shield him from whatever came next. "You've got 10 seconds to get off my land," John said, his voice low and steady, yet carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. "I won't ask again." The taller man scoffed, attempting to project confidence he clearly didn't feel. "Look, buddy, we're just doing our jobs. We don't want any trouble." "Then, leave," John interrupted, cutting him off mid-sentence. His tone left no room for argument. "You're trespassing, plain and simple. If you don't leave now, I'll make sure you regret it." For a moment, neither side moved. The air crackled with silent defiance. Then, almost imperceptibly, the two men exchanged a glance, a fleeting look that revealed their uncertainty. Whatever bravado they'd mustered earlier was beginning to crumble under John's unwavering gaze. But instead of backing down completely, they decided to press forward, perhaps hoping that sheer persistence would wear him out. Ignoring John's warning, they took another step inside the gate, pretending to inspect the area. The taller man pointed vaguely toward a patch of tall grass near the fence line. "This right here is a violation," he declared, trying to sound official. "Grass can't exceed 6 inches in height according to HOA guidelines." John let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Guidelines? You still think I care about your fake rules? Let me spell this out for you. There is no HOA. This is private property, and I run things my way. Now turn around and walk away while you still can." But the men weren't listening anymore. Their arrogance, or maybe their desperation, had clouded their judgment. Instead of retreating, they wandered farther onto the property, heading toward the open field where John's recruits were conducting a training exercise. That's when things went from tense to dangerous. Unbeknownst to the intruders, the recruits were in the middle of a live fire simulation, a controlled environment designed to mimic real combat scenarios. Paintball guns loaded with non-lethal rounds were being used to simulate gunfire, creating realistic conditions for the trainees. It was intense, immersive, and not something anyone without clearance should stumble into. When John spotted the men walking blindly toward the exercise zone, his blood ran cold. These idiots were putting themselves, and potentially others, in harm's way. Without hesitation, John signaled to his recruits using a series of hand gestures they understood immediately. Within moments, the exercise paused, and several trainees broke away from the group, moving swiftly to intercept the trespassers. Dressed head to toe in tactical gear, their faces partially obscured by helmets and goggles, the recruits looked every bit like elite operatives ready for battle. To the two men, however, they were terrifying apparitions emerging from the trees. "What the?" The shorter man stammered, stumbling backward as the figures surrounded them. The taller man tried to put on a brave face, but his hands trembled, visibly as he gripped his clipboard tighter. Hey, we're just doing an inspection," he blurted out, his voice rising in panic. "We're authorized." "Authorized?" John repeated, stepping closer. He gestured to the recruits, who now formed a tight circle around the intruders. "Let me show you what authorized really looks like." One of the trainees approached the taller man and held out a gloved hand. "Clipboard," he commanded, sharply. The man hesitated for a split second before handing it over, his face pale. Another recruit confiscated the shorter man's hat, which had slipped slightly during the commotion. Both intruders looked utterly bewildered, their previous bravado evaporating like mist in the morning sun. John crossed his arms and addressed them directly. "You came onto my property uninvited, ignored my warnings, and disrupted a training operation. Do you have any idea how serious that is?" The taller man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. We didn't mean any harm," he stuttered. We thought you were just some guy living out here alone." John raised an eyebrow. "Well, you thought wrong." To drive the point home, John instructed the recruits to escort the men back to their truck, a task they carried out with military precision. Each step was deliberate, each movement calculated to keep the intruders off balance. The two men stumbled, along, their legs wobbling as if unsure whether to run or comply. By the time they reached the vehicle, they were visibly shaken, their earlier cockiness replaced by wide-eyed fear. As the recruit stood guard, John retrieved the confiscated items and returned them to the men. "Here's your stuff," he said, tossing the clipboard and hat into the bed of their truck. "And here's my final warning. If I ever catch you on my property again, I won't be so lenient. Got it?" The shorter man nodded furiously, while the taller one managed a weak, "Yes, sir." Neither dared to argue or protest further. They scrambled into the truck, started the engine, and sped away, leaving behind a trail of dust that quickly dissipated in the breeze. Once they were gone, John turned to his recruits, who were already breaking formation and returning to their exercises. "Good work," he said simply, offering a nod of approval. "Let's finish up here and call it a day." Later that evening, as John sat on his porch reflecting on the incident, he couldn't help but feel a mix order. Something about those men unsettled him. Not just their audacity, but the fact that they kept coming back despite his clear warnings. Who were they, really? And why were they so determined to harass him? His instincts told him this wasn't over. Whatever game these imposters were playing, it was far from finished, and John knew better than most that preparation was key. If they returned, he'd be ready. The dust from the intruder's truck had barely settled before John's mind began racing. He didn't trust those men or their motives for a second. Something about their behavior gnawed at him, like an itch he couldn't scratch. They weren't just random troublemakers. There was purpose behind their persistence, even if it seemed misguided or amateurish. And that made them dangerous. John knew better than to let curiosity get the better of him without proper preparation. Over decades in high-stakes environments, he'd learned one critical lesson. Never underestimate your opponent, no matter how foolish they appeared. These so-called HOA enforcers might have been bumbling amateurs, but they were still trespassing on his land and refusing to back down despite repeated warnings. That kind of stubbornness could escalate into something far more serious if left unchecked. As night fell over the property, John decided it was time to dig deeper. Sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, he pulled out his laptop and started researching. His first step was simple: verifying whether the organization these men claimed to represent actually existed. Using the information printed on the letter they'd sent weeks earlier, the logo, address, and contact details, he began searching online for any mention of the supposed homeowners association. What he found shocked him. The website looked professional enough at first glance: polished graphics, stock photos of smiling families in suburban neighborhoods, and promises of maintaining community standards. But as John scrolled through the pages, he noticed inconsistencies. There were no real names listed for board members, only generic titles like community manager or compliance officer. The phone number provided led to a voicemail system with a robotic voice, not a live person. Even the physical address listed turned out to be nothing more than a rented mailbox at a local UPS store. It didn't take long for John to piece together the truth. This HOA was fake. A scam designed to intimidate homeowners into paying fees under the guise of enforcing non-existent rules. It was clever in its simplicity, preying on people's fears of authority and desire to avoid conflict. Most folks would probably pay up just to make the problem go away, but John wasn't most folks. The realization hit him hard. These men weren't just pests. They were con artists, exploiting others for profit. And now, they had targeted him. While John felt anger simmering beneath the surface, he also recognized an opportunity. If he played his cards right, he could turn this situation around, not just for himself, but for anyone else who might fall victim to their schemes. Laying a trap. By the next morning, John had formulated a plan. He wouldn't confront the men directly again, at least not yet. Instead, he would use their arrogance against them. People who believed themselves untouchable often made careless mistakes, and John intended to exploit every single one. First, he set up surveillance cameras around the perimeter of his property. Hidden among the trees and rocks, the devices blended seamlessly with the natural landscape. Anyone looking closely might spot them, but John doubted the intruders would bother. They clearly underestimated him, assuming he was just another rural homeowner with no resources or connections. He let them keep thinking that. Next, John reached out to a trusted friend named Marcus, a tech-savvy cybersecurity expert who specialized in tracking down scammers. Marcus had helped John uncover shady dealings before, and this time was no different. After sharing the details of the fake HOA and providing copies of the letters and website screenshots, Marcus went to work. Within hours, he uncovered a trail of digital breadcrumbs leading back to the masterminds behind the operation. It turned out the scam had been running for months, targeting dozens of properties across several counties. Complaints had trickled in here and there, but no one had managed to connect the dots until now. Armed with evidence, John contacted local law enforcement. He explained the situation calmly, presenting everything he'd gathered: the fraudulent website, the suspicious addresses, and the pattern of harassment. The officers listened intently, nodding as they realized the scope of the operation. One detective even admitted that they'd received similar complaints recently, but hadn't been able to identify the culprits. With John's findings, however, They finally had enough to launch a formal investigation. A lesson in authority. While waiting for the authorities to take action, John decided to teach the intruders one final lesson, one they wouldn't soon forget. When the two men returned days later, predictably ignoring his previous warning, John was ready. This time he greeted them not alone, but flanked by a small group of his trainees, all dressed in full tactical gear and armed with paintball, rifles loaded with bright orange rounds. "Welcome back," John said dryly as the men stepped out of their truck. Their smug expressions faltered when they saw the scene unfolding before them. "I see you didn't learn your lesson last time." The taller man tried to laugh it off. "Oh, come on. We're just doing our job. You don't need to bring out the army for this," John smirked. "You think this is an army? Trust me, you haven't seen anything yet." With a sharp whistle, John signaled the recruits to advance. The men froze as the team surrounded them, moving with precision and discipline honed through years of training. Each recruit carried themselves with quiet confidence, exuding an aura of authority that left no doubt about their capabilities. To the intruders, it must have felt like stepping into a war zone. "Here's how this is going to work," John explained, his tone clipped and authoritative. "You're going to experience exactly what happens when unauthorized individuals enter restricted territory. Consider it a crash course in respecting boundaries." Over the next hour, the recruits put the men through a series of controlled exercises designed to simulate real-world security scenarios. They blindfolded the intruders and guided them through mock checkpoints, demonstrating how quickly someone could be detained and disarmed in a hostile environment. At one point, the trainees fired paintball rounds near, but not at, the men, creating bursts of harmless but startling orange splatter on nearby trees. The message was clear. These recruits were trained professionals, capable of handling far worse situations than a couple of imposters. By the end of the demonstration, both men were visibly shaken. Sweat dripped down their faces, and their hands trembled as they fumbled with their belongings. The taller man attempted to protest weakly, but his voice cracked under the weight of fear. Okay, we get it. We won't come back." John nodded, satisfied. "Good, because if I ever see you on my property again, the consequences will be much worse than a few paintballs." He handed them their confiscated items once more and escorted them back to their truck. As they drove away, John couldn't help but smile grimly. Sometimes a little fear went a long way in teaching respect. Turning the tables. In the days that followed, John stayed in close contact with law enforcement. The investigation into the fake HOA picked up speed, thanks largely to the evidence he'd provided. Officers tracked down other victims of the scam, piecing together a comprehensive case against the perpetrators. Meanwhile, John shared his story online, posting detailed accounts of the encounters and warning others to beware of similar scams. To his surprise, the post went viral, sparking outrage and admiration from thousands of readers. People praised John for standing up to bullies and protecting his rights, while others thanked him for exposing the scam. Local news outlets picked up the story, interviewing John about his experiences. When asked why he'd gone to such lengths to fight back, he gave a simple answer: "Because nobody should be allowed to intimidate honest, hard-working people into submission. Not on my watch." As for the fake HOA cops, their reign of terror came to an abrupt end. Both men were arrested and charged with fraud, along with several accomplices involved in running the scheme. Facing mounting legal pressure, they confessed to their crimes, revealing the full extent of their operation. The fallout served as a wake-up call for communities across the region, prompting discussions about how to better protect homeowners from predatory practices. For John, the ordeal reinforced a fundamental truth: strength and integrity mattered. Whether facing down enemies on a battlefield or standing up to imposters on his own land, he knew the value of staying true to oneself. And though he never sought recognition, his actions inspired countless others to do the same, to stand firm, speak out, and refuse to back down when confronted with injustice. Little did John know this was only the beginning of his journey. The arrest of the fake HOA enforcers marked a turning point, Not just for John Harper, but for everyone who had been affected by their scam. News of their downfall spread quickly, thanks in large part to John's decision to share his story online. What started as a simple post warning others about fraudulent HOAs turned into a viral sensation overnight. People were captivated by the tale of a quiet, unassuming homeowner who stood up to imposters and exposed their scheme with military precision. The internet buzzed with comments, memes, and even fan art depicting John as some kind of modern-day folk hero, but fame wasn't something John sought or wanted. He didn't post updates seeking attention or validation. He simply wanted to ensure no one else fell victim to similar scams. Yet, the overwhelming response caught him off guard. Messages poured in from all over the country, some thanking him for raising awareness, others sharing their own stories of being harassed by fake authorities. A few even joked that they wished they had Navy SEALs training on their property when scammers came knocking. Despite the unexpected spotlight, John remained focused on what mattered most: protecting his land, continuing his work, and ensuring justice was served. As law enforcement delved deeper into the case, more details emerged about the scope of the scam. It turned out the operation was far more extensive than anyone initially realized. Dozens of homeowners across multiple counties had been targeted, many paying hundreds or even thousands of dollars to resolve violations that never existed in the first place. Some victims admitted they'd felt too intimidated to question the legitimacy of the claims, while others simply didn't know where to turn for help. For John, this revelation only fueled his determination to see the perpetrators held accountable. He worked closely with investigators, providing additional insights and connecting them with other victims willing to come forward. His involvement didn't stop there, though. Recognizing an opportunity to make a broader impact, John began advocating for stronger protections against predatory practices like these. He spoke at community meetings, wrote opinion pieces for local newspapers, and even appeared on television to discuss the importance of knowing your rights as a homeowner. From intrusion to inspiration, while the legal process played out, life on John's property returned to its usual rhythm. The recruits resumed their training exercises, undisturbed by further intrusions. Word of John's confrontation with the fake HOA officers spread among the trainees, earning him newfound respect from those who already admired his skills and leadership. To them, he wasn't just a retired Navy SEAL teaching survival techniques. He was proof that courage and resourcefulness could overcome any challenge. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields, John gathered the group around a campfire. They sat cross-legged on the ground, passing around plates of steaming food cooked over the flames. The mood was relaxed, almost festive, but John knew it was also a chance to impart lessons beyond physical training. "Listen up," he said, leaning forward slightly so everyone could hear him clearly. "What happened with those guys wasn't just about defending my property. It was about standing up for yourself when someone tries to push you around. Whether it's a scammer pretending to be an authority figure or someone trying to take advantage of you, the principle is the same. Don't let them win." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Now, I'm not saying violence is the answer. In fact, it rarely is. But sometimes showing strength means using your head instead of your fists. You have to think strategically, anticipate their moves, and act decisively. That's how you gain control of a situation." The year. Recruits listened intently, nodding along as John spoke. Many of them had joined the program hoping to improve their combat skills, but they quickly learned that leadership and mental toughness were equally important. Stories like John's reinforced those lessons in ways classroom lectures never could. A new chapter. As weeks turned into months, the fallout from the fake HOA scandal continued to unfold. Both men involved in targeting John's property pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including fraud and impersonating law enforcement. Their accomplices faced similar consequences, bringing closure to countless victims who had suffered in silence. Local lawmakers began drafting legislation aimed at cracking down on such scams, citing John's case as a prime example of why action was needed. Meanwhile, John found himself at the center of something much bigger than he'd anticipated. Media. Outlets clamored for interviews, eager to capture the essence of the man behind the legend. Documentaries were pitched, books proposed, and even a Hollywood producer reached out, suggesting the story might make for a compelling film. At first, John dismissed these offers outright. He wasn't interested in becoming a celebrity, but as time went on, he realized the platform could serve a greater purpose. "If telling my story helps protect people from getting scammed," he told Marcus during one of their late-night phone calls, "then maybe it's worth it." With that mindset, John agreed to participate in select projects, always emphasizing the importance of education and prevention. He collaborated with consumer protection agencies to create resources for homeowners, teaching them how to spot red flags and report suspicious activity. He also partnered with veterans organizations to promote awareness of scams targeting older adults, a demographic particularly vulnerable to such schemes. Through it all, John stayed grounded, refusing to let the attention distract him from his core mission. His property remained a sanctuary, a place where discipline, resilience, and teamwork took precedence over fame or fortune. Even as his name became synonymous with standing up to injustice, he continued living life on his own terms, surrounded by the things that mattered most. Lessons learned. Looking back on the ordeal, John couldn't help but reflect on the lessons it taught him, and the world. The experience reinforced his belief in the power of preparation and adaptability. Life, he often reminded himself, was unpredictable. No matter how peaceful things seemed, challenges could arise without warning. The key was to stay ready, both mentally and physically, to face whatever came your way. It also highlighted the importance of community. Though John valued his solitude, he understood that no one could thrive alone. From his recruits to Marcus, from local law enforcement to strangers online, the support he received throughout the ordeal proved invaluable. Together, they achieved something none of them could have accomplished individually. Most importantly, the incident reminded John of the value of integrity. In a world filled with deception and exploitation, staying true to oneself was more important than ever. Whether confronting fake HOA officers or navigating the complexities of sudden fame, John approached every situation with honesty and authenticity. It wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. As the seasons changed and the land grew quieter once again, John felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The intruders were gone, the scam dismantled, and his message heard loud and clear. But he knew better than to grow complacent. Life had taught him that vigilance was key, and he planned to remain vigilant for as long as it took. After all, John Harper wasn't just a man who trained Navy SEALs or fought off imposters. He was a symbol of strength, resilience, and unwavering determination, a reminder that sometimes the best way to fight back against injustice was to show the world exactly what you were capable of. And if that meant taking on fake cops, exposing scams, or inspiring others to stand their ground, then so be it.